Boats. They're kind of cool. They do cool things, and they allow countries to be big boys on the world stage. But some countries aren't too great at boats. They, for better or for worse, just don't really work. And one of those is Russia. They never really understood the whole Navy thing and had it work properly. Granted, there are a few exceptions, like the Brig Mercury and the cruiser Variag, but in most cases, these are exceptions of absolute desperation. And yeah, it doesn't usually end well for the crews involved. But when we talk about the Russian Navy, I don't mean to tell you just about the modern one. I'm not telling you just about the SARS Navy. I'm telling you about all of the navies. And hold on to your hats, get a drink, and sit down, because as the old saying goes, when it comes to Russian naval history, and then it got worse. And the goal of this is to teach you all, once and for all, that the Russian Navy is, was, and always has been a complete piece of fucking shit. Imagine, if you will, your countrymen have been attacked. They are under siege in the far-off Port Arthur, and only you in Europe can sail to their rescue. The brave Variag fought valiantly, ambushed by a superior force, and had been lost. Again, this is out of desperation. The one time they're competent is when it gets really desperate, but I mean, it has to be really desperate. Now, you must get there as quickly as possible, but you're in Europe, and you can't sail north through the Arctic because just don't in this time period. So you're going to have to sail around the entire world. But because without your help, everything is going to go badly. There's no way you'll win the war. Odds are if you get there, you probably won't win too, but hey, you still got to try. And that's the exact situation the Russian Baltic Fleet found itself during the Russo-Japanese War in October 1904. Now the Tsar, he sent Admiral Makarov, a very capable officer, and quite honestly, probably one of the only two competent officers in the Russian Navy at this point, to the east, and he actually began to turn things around, but he was decapitated when the Petropavlovsk got hit by a mine. Yes, it hit by a mine, and then a big hunk of debris flew up and decapitated him. It's quite gruesome. Anyway, enter stage right, Admiral Rossisvensky, a man who I feel so sorry for. At this point, I just want to give him a damn hug. Now, we're going to call him Admiral Rossi at this point, because I'm not saying Rossisvensky about 50 times. Now, Rossi's commanded a large fleet that was being accumulated in St. Petersburg and the surrounding naval bases for the voyage to the east. Majority of Russia's best ships are actually in the Black Sea at this point, and they are there to fight the Turks. But to be honest, when I say best ships, I say best ships as in the sense the $20 vodka will not make you go blind, whereas the $10 one probably will, but the $20 one might give you liver failure. That's what we mean by best here. Unless we're talking about the Aurora, in which case everyone shut up because that thing is beautiful and doesn't deserve what's happening to it. Anyway, now the idea of Rossi's fleet sitting up in St. Petersburg was to sail around the world to Port Arthur, smash the Japanese Navy, and win the war with a resounding woohoo, Russia numero uno. Now, slight issues with that. The Russian ships have short range. They have no ports between Europe and Asia, and we're talking the round bit here, not going through Russia, because, boats can't go over land. Another slight issue is Russia's ships are kind of designed for, Russian waters. And the thing about Russia is if you've ever looked at it, it's quite far north and it's a bit cold. But, this isn't important. Just ignore that. It's time to smack Japan silly and win the war. Now, the greatest thing that the Russian Navy had going for it was, and this is a complete mystery as to how this happened to any officer in the Russian Navy, was that Admiral Rossi wasn't actually corrupt, and he was actually competent, which is completely rare, and it's just unheard of, especially in a modern sense, but that's by the by. Now, a Russian commander who wasn't incompetent, what a thought that is. And Admiral Rossi would also beat senseless, yes, with his fist, anyone who severely annoyed him. This included other officers, probably why he wasn't the most popular. Anyway, on the 15th of October, 1904, 45 Russian ships with chartered freighters following them around set sail for the east. Well, west. They're going east, but they need to go west to go around things. Now, however, before the ships even leave port, the Orel, brand new, the Eagle, a battleship, had a worker remove a panel on its hull and go home for the night, ignoring the fact that boats need to be watertight, and it promptly sank at the dock. auspicious start. Anyway, the fleet set sail ignoring that, including a very eclectic bunch of small ironclads, modern pre-dreadnoughts. There was an aristocratic yacht with a gun bolted onto it, a hospital ship, an icebreaker, because, famously need icebreakers in the south of Japan, and through the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, and the Atlantic. Never mind, ignore it. A smattering of newish cruisers, including the very sexy Aurora. I mean, god damn it, look at those lines. Look at it! Oh, anyway, these crews were also mostly conscripts from central Russia, and many of them had never even seen the sea. And the captains were of the kind who would anchor their ships behind cruisers so they couldn't be seen and leave to go and get drunk without their officers noticing. Again, the Russian Navy hasn't changed much since 1904. Now, the ships were provided with enough ammunition for a major battle, with a little extra just in case, it was a particularly sporting battle, but gunnery practice was deemed not necessary. You can see where this is going. Anyway, the ships left harbour, well, some of them, as the flagship again immediately ran aground and a cruiser lost an anchor. I don't know how. And another destroyer decided to ram a battleship. But anyway, they got out of harbour, and the fleet then passed Denmark, and all of a sudden a crisis happened. Random sailors started screaming that they were all doomed because Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats were waiting near Sweden to kill them. Geography not being a Russian strong suit, just looking at you, Vlad. And so the fleet accidentally began ramming Danish coal ships, trying to refuel them. And another ship had a lifeboat fall off. It just fell off. The icebreaker proceeded to be handled so poorly that Admiral Rossi started shooting at it and sent it home. I just want to point out we haven't passed Denmark yet. We are still in Russia's front yard. Admiral Rossi tries to calm everyone down at this point by saying, no vessel should be allowed to get amongst the fleet. Just as a fishing vessel carrying a message from the Tsar to tell Admiral Rossi that he'd been promoted arrived. None of the warships, who the majority of which started shooting at said fishing boat, came close to hitting it, and the fishing boat's captain wasn't even aware that he was being shot at by over 40 vessels. We're not even past Denmark yet. The repair ship Kamchatka proceeded to declare that she was being attacked on all sides by 8 torpedo boats. Nobody else saw them, and Kamchatka proceeded to say, oh, they went away because we turned. Yeah, we'll get to Kamchatka later. Now, the fleet, it's getting close to Dogger Bank, and then it finally happened. Torpedo boats, the fleet immediately turned to fire, all guns blazing, shells raining from the heavens, with multiple ships reporting they'd been torpedoed, and their crewmen laid on the deck proceeding to sink. Crewmen ran around the deck swinging swords and firing pistols to rebel boarders. The battleships at last damaged 4 of their targets and sank 1. Victory was at hand, and at last the Variag's defeat in the east would be avenged. However, slight problem, 2 of the damaged targets were Aurora, and the other cruiser was the Dmitry Donskoy, both shot at by their own side, and the rest were British trawlers from Hull. And most of the ships had fired every single round they had and hit nothing. The British weren't exactly pleased about this, and the public wanted a war because they couldn't believe someone could be so damn stupid to do this on accident. And at this point, the entire Royal Navy in Europe, which is much bigger than the entire Russian Navy, and this isn't even the largest British fleet, was put on standby, and they outnumbered the Russians at least 4-1. Admiral Beresford decided to be a bit jovial and commented that he would only use 4 battleships to sink the entire Russian fleet based on the caliber of their gunnery skills. Add any more would just be unfair and unsportsmanlike. He's probably not wrong, I'm not going to lie. Now, Rossi decided it was maybe time to leave European waters, but he did dock first to ditch many of the horribly useless officers as possible, including a particular captain who Rossi wanted to beat senseless on the bridge of his flagship a couple days earlier. Now, he went back to St. Petersburg with the order to get reinforcements. Keep in mind they took every major ship that they could get out of St. Petersburg, but we'll get to the 3rd Pacific Squadron later. The fleet then split, with the older ships going around through the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal, and the newest and fastest Russian ships, including the flagships, sailing around the Cape, and both fleets would then meet in Madagascar. The Kamchatka finally appeared, saying she'd been attacked by 300 shells at 3 Japanese ships. However, these ships included a Swedish merchant, a French merchant, and a German trawler. Didn't hit a single thing, and as the fleet left Tangier, a ship broke the underwater telegraph cable with its anchor, and now Tangier couldn't talk to its home country. Well, it's really colonial power. It's going well. We haven't left Europe yet. Still in Europe. Now, Rossi, at this point, was a little pissed off with the Kamchatka, and he ordered it to stay as close to the flagship as possible, and he would periodically scream at it and throw his binoculars at it. His staff, understanding that he did this regularly, so kept a large stock of binoculars there with him. Now, remember what I said about them not having much range for fuel? Yeah, we're about to talk about that. So, to avoid refueling as consistently, as in like every second damn day, the Russian ships would store coal literally everywhere, including crew quarters, corridors, mess halls. Basically, if you sit down to go to the toilet, you can rest your feet on a bag of coal, that kind of stuff. Slight issue with that. Remember how they're also designed to be cold? Yeah, well, they're insulated very well because they're designed to be in the cold. As we get closer to Africa, it kind of gets a little hot. And the ships at this point turned into effectively fuel-air bombs with all the coal dust in the air that can't escape. And so crewmen start dying because coal keeps getting into their lungs and causing probably likely cases of tuberculosis and other things. We're still in Africa. We haven't got to the Indian Ocean yet. Now, all of a sudden, a storm hits the fleet, and they're probably all thinking, thank God we can wash away some of the coal gas. But all of a sudden, the Chatka alerts the fleet saying, hey, do you see any torpedo boats? At this point, Admiral Rossi began to develop nicknames for ships and captains who particularly annoyed him. Some highlights include the slutty old geezer, the brainless nihilist, I know a few of those from uni, and other colourful ones, including the lecherous slut, aka the artist formerly known as Kamchatka. When a ship particularly annoyed Rossi, he put it in the naughty corner. Quite literally, he put it behind the flagship and proceeded to use a yeldy microphone to scream at the ship while throwing binoculars at them. Again, thankfully, his staff bought 50 pairs. I wish we knew how many he had left at the end. Now, as Rossi's squadron rounded Cape Town in South Africa, we're finally in the Indian Ocean, he found out that captain was coming with reinforcements in the form of the 3rd Pacific Squadron, which was entirely composed of ships that were known as the Sink by Themselves Squadron, when they were in port. Rossi now proceeded to refuse to tell anyone where he was going, so they would not be able to rendezvous. The Admiral in charge of the 3rd Pacific Squadron thus received the following order from Russian Naval High Command. You are to rendezvous with Admiral Rossosvensky, whose route is unknown to us. At about this time, the British commander in Durban, being cheeky, turned around and said, don't worry, there's no fishing boats around here. Right about now, news filtered through that Port Arthur had surrendered, and the Russian ships there had been sunk, and it was a tremendous blow to morale. Now, we're going to do something fun here. We're going to have a quick quiz. Will the Russian fleet, when it reaches Madagascar for its rendezvous, wait patiently, relax and allow the crews to train, or start a floating zoo and have a poisonous snake attack the crew, have a crocodile on board and a collection of monkeys while also doing exercises and accidentally shooting the Aurora during a funeral for a dead crew member? You got C, you win a bicky. I'm not buying you the bicky, you have to buy it yourself. Take it as a moral prize. Now, somebody sent Admiral Rossi a parrot at this point as a gift, because of course you do. The parrot, in a very jovial, high age of piracy manner, proceeded to learn every swear word in the Russian language while the flagship itself was overrun with chameleons. I suppose at least you wouldn't be able to see them, so you wouldn't know the problem was there. Now, the poor Aurora was so filled with creatures at this point that the crew was refusing to sleep due to fear of being eaten. At this point, the fleet's cold storage broke down and hundreds of tons of rotting meat was thrown overboard, adding, as the great YouTuber Drakenfell said, the sea life exhibit to the zoo that was quickly forming. Now, it's finally time to leave Madagascar after, shooting the Aurora again and missing with a torpedo and ordering a bunch of destroyers to sail in formation who immediately scattered away from each other. It's a whole thing. And having a few other issues. Now, as the fleet was sailing across the Indian Ocean, Admiral Rossi got very sick and his chief of staff had a brain hemorrhage. I'm guessing stress might have been a factor here. So the ships decided to then stay in harbour a little longer. And at this point, every single STD known to humanity became commonplace amongst the fleet, along with a particularly roaring trade of opium and alcohol, because it's a Russian fleet. What the hell did you expect? But don't worry, it gets worse. Revolution, religious zealotry, and mental breakdown time, with one member of the crew walking around naked, and I still laugh every time I see this, asking everyone with a straight face, do you fear death? Rossi recovers here. Somehow, I don't know, mentally he's probably gone by this point, but he discovers many of the officers were absolutely off their faces on the aforementioned opium and other hard drugs. But finally, a bit of normalcy might come because a supply ship arrived with ammunition, so they could do some more practice. But never mind, a supply ship arrived in Madagascar with 12,000 winter boots and coats. In Madagascar. Yeah, because you need it there. Anyway, more friendly fire later, including a nearly torpedoing of a destroyer in the fleet and a signal from Kamchatka saying, "Oh no, I'm sinking at my moorings," and the fleet finally left port. Kamchatka was not sinking. Now, slight issue at this point on the Aurora, lemurs were quite literally everywhere. They were moving all around the ship, and I don't understand why Aurora got treated so badly in this voyage. Like, they even organized a competent boat race when they were in port, and then they got shot at by their own team member while towing a target. Aurora didn't deserve this shit. No wonder it started a revolution. Anyway, the ships finally met with Admiral Gorbachev. Anyway, the Gorbachev didn't come from home. It was that same supply ship that gave them the coats in Madagascar, and it got lost on the way home, sailed at a big circle, and met the fleet again. Yeah, I suppose. These were chartered freighters too. Anyway, horror finally happened. On the 11th of November 1905, the worst happened. The 3rd Pacific Squadron found Admiral Rossi near Vietnam, or French Indochina at the time, and they were even more useless. At this point, Rossi tried to resign. The Tsar turns around and says no. To be fair to the Tsar at this point, as much of an idiot as he was, Rossi was probably the only hope he had, and even then it was a foregone conclusion. The ships decided to sail north for battle with the Japanese together, and they were promptly absolutely slaughtered, with 5,000 dead, 803 injured, 6,000 captured, 6 battleships sunk, a coastal battleship sunk, 14 other ships sunk, 2 battleships captured, 2 coastal battleships captured, a destroyer captured, and 6 ships disarmed. Rossi thankfully survives, goes back home, and it's a whole thing. But honestly, at that point, I think he was just a gone man, broken mentally. This was just one instance. And if you think this is a one-off in history, oh boy, do we have news for you. So let's talk about the Moskva, the modern Russian Navy, the Moskva. Yes, that thing that was sunk by the nation that does not have a navy at the moment. And I'm not kidding. At the time, Ukraine's biggest ship was a riverboat. It still is. Well, it's not now. There's multiple minesweepers and a corvette being built, but effectively that they still have just riverboats and a landing craft from the 70s. But anyway, yeah, unless you're Russian and you think it sank in a storm, which just appeared out of nowhere on a completely calm day and managed to disappear after starting a fire aboard the ship, which looked like it had been hit by a missile, but yeah. If they said the sky was blue at this point, I'd probably still check. But anyway, the Moskva, historically named the Slava, or the Glory in English, was, as shockingly enough, a Slava-class cruiser that was so-called a carrier killer. Basically, the idea was they could be so covered in missiles they could just fling all the shit at the proverbial wall and something would stick. The idea was it would overwhelm a US carrier group's defenses and sink the carrier. Maybe possible in the 60s, but yeah, it was designed in the 70s, and by now it's 53 years old. And as one you could say, it had a lackluster maintenance work history, as everything does in the Russian Navy. So the Moskva, which grew to fame from the Snake Island incident in the first days of the war, was plodding around the Black Sea, trying to use its anti-air system to assist the Russians in holding Snake Island, with occasional reported shore bombardment against Odessa. Now, this could be propaganda, as the Moskva didn't have a ground attack ability, but the Russians have been using the S-300 missile system, of which the ship was armored for ground attack, so as Laserpick said, it's a bit fucky-wucky. Take whatever side you want. I personally believe the Ukrainian source on this because they've lied less. Anyway, so the thing about the Moskva, it was given a clean bill of satisfactory by the Russian Navy, but the following was wrong with the ship. The short-range C-2 air launchers just flat-out didn't work. The Russian version of Phalanx, the Moskva had about 6, only 1 worked, and the other 5 were cannibalized to keep the 1 working. Theoretically, the S-300s could have worked, but the radar couldn't be turned on because it made the ship's radio not work somehow. The main gun was broken because of a hydraulic leak. The watertight doors were largely wedged open because they were, again, broken. The majority of the 500 fire extinguishers were missing. The remaining safety equipment was locked away because only the Admiral had the key due to constant theft. The engines were just fucked beyond belief because that ship could only go at half speed in a pinch because Russia doesn't know what maintenance is. The dynamos were about 50-50 for the electronics if they would work. The steering gear could only turn at 20 degrees. And the galley and crew quarters were about as well kept and sanitary as Skid Row in Los Angeles. Go Russia. At this point, the majority of the crew, who likely did die in the ship sinking, have been reported as missing or just ignored. Now, when I say majority who did die, I'm talking about the ones who are missing, who are definitely not alive at this point. Just they're not. And so parents and families can't even bury their loved ones because Russia, number one, it was an accident. Ukraine could never sink the Moskva, even though the Neptune definitely did. And the Russian government claims only 5 crew members lost their lives. There are 26 still missing who are dead. They're just dead. If they're not dead in the sinking, they were probably thrown at Vuhledar in a freaking police APC and told to drive across a minefield. Funnily enough, Ukraine's now declared the wreck a cultural heritage site. Make of that what you will. I think it was quite funny. So yeah, that's 2 examples, but I'm not sitting here all day. So here's a fun little hot list for you over the years. 1876, Russia commissions a circular warship that when turning spun like a giant aquatic Roomba. 1916, brand new dreadnought Imperatrice Maya blew up in port. 1930s, Nevening class destroyers who would occasionally have hulls shatter when they hit waves joined the fleet. Weird that, hitting a wave at sea. Yeah. 1945, chronic Soviet alcoholic captain of a submarine blew up the SS Wilhelm Gustloff with 9,000 refugees on it. This one's just fucking evil, but woo, go Soviet Navy. 1949, British battleship on loan to the Soviets, which was HMS Royal Sovereign, aka Archangel, is returned so dirty and badly kept that the guns can no longer turn and operate, and the ship is subsequently condemned because it was not safe to be on. 1955, the battleship Novorossiysk, an ex-Italian battleship, explodes at anchor. 1961, K-19, the submarine has a reactor leak and Chernobyl some of the crew. 1973, Kiev-class carriers enter service. The Yak-38, its aircraft had a tendency just to fall out of the sky. 1975, a Soviet officer committed mutiny on the frigate Storozhevoy, tried to sail to Leningrad and broadcast a message about Leninism. He believed this would overthrow the corrupt leadership and restore Leninism. 1986, submarine K219 explodes due to a leak. 1989, submarine K278 submerges too well and sinks. 1996, Admiral Kuznetsov water reclaimer breaks down in the Mediterranean Sea. Nearby American warships have to offer to provide water, but are refused. Instead, the crew is no longer allowed to do basic things like bathe and brush their teeth. In 2001, the Iosjpe class submarine Kursk sank because it blew up due to firing a Second World War torpedo that had been in storage for 60 years. The Russian government again refused foreign help to get the crew out of the sinking alive. They all then die. 2009, Kuznetsov catches fire in the Black Sea. 2009, Kuznetsov causes an oil spill in the North Sea. 2012, Kuznetsov breaks down again due to poorly maintained engines. 2016, Kuznetsov's arresting gear caused a plane to drop into the ocean because it keeps snapping. 2016, Kuznetsov's arresting gear is so broken, a MiG-29 runs out of fuel and crashes into the ocean because it can't land. 2018, a Russian floating dry dock in Murmansk starts sinking because the auxiliary fuel stores have been sold off by the officer in charge. A large crane proceeds to fall on the Kuznetsov. 2019, Kuznetsov catches fire in Murmansk. 2022, Kuznetsov catches fire in... This is the Russian Navy, folks. It's just the gift that keeps on fucking giving. I swear. Anyway, that's all.